The psychedelic revolution is here. If you want to integrate your visionary experiences into your purpose, get clear on your entrepreneurial path, and help people while you do what you love, then this podcast is for you. Welcome to The Psychedelic Entrepreneur, Medicine for These Times. I'm your host, Beth Weinstein. I'm a spiritual business coach, 3-time entrepreneur, and a lifelong student of psychedelics and sacred plant medicines. You carry your own unique medicine, and your medicine is what we need for these times. This podcast will help you to share your medicine so you can create transformation in the world. Listen in on conversations with psychedelic leaders, changemakers, and conscious entrepreneurs who are living proof that a better world is possible when you follow your heart and live in alignment with your soul. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Medicine for These Times. I'm so happy to be talking to Madison Margolin. I interviewed you, I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago. And wow, so much has happened. You've published a book. You've moved on to bigger, better places in the world. And your work has blown up so much. And I can't wait to hear more about what is going on and to discuss what's happening in the medicine space, the psychedelic space. So thank you so much for being here with us.
Thanks for having me.
So Madison is a journalist covering psychedelics and spirituality. She is the author of the new book, Exile and Ecstasy, Growing Up with Ram Dass and Coming of Age in the Jewish Psychedelic Underground. Also the host of the Be Here Now Network's Set and Setting podcast, as well as the co-founder of both Double Blind Magazine and the Jewish Psychedelic Summit. She has written for publications like Rolling Stone, Playboy, Vice, High Times, Lucid News, and Iron Press, where she works as an editor curating psychedelic stories and interviews. Check out her website and all her other links right here in the show notes. Madison, before we get into all this amazing work that you're doing and your new book, for those that have not heard your story before, you have a very unique and interesting story. I think you're one of the few people I know where this psychedelic work was really ingrained into your whole entire upbringing. Let's hear your story. How'd you get here and really, on this path of being a psychedelic journalist?
Yeah, so I grew up in sort of a psychedelic household, you could say. My parents are hippies. My dad's a criminal defense lawyer who specializes in cannabis cases. And he came up in the 1960s. And so a lot of his clients were just like the original hippie generation, including Timothy Leary. My dad also, he had gone to India, in the early 70s, kind of like looking for spiritual sustenance, ended up meeting Ram Dass there, the author of Be Here Now, and following a guru named Curly Baba or Maharaji, who's also Ram Dass's guru. And so I grew up in this community of devotees of the guru and, people who had been influenced by psychedelics and looking to sort of, integrate those experiences with spiritual practice. And so, for my dad and his friends, it was, this kind of Hindu type of practice. They were mostly Jewish people who ended up in India. So that really colored the way that I saw spirituality, saw psychedelic culture, etc. And I was always very curious, is what my parents are looking for in Hinduism and other cultures actually available within Judaism. And so long story short, I was a journalism student and was assigned to report on the Hasidic community in New York. And I ended up meeting people there who had sort of had their own wayward paths and experimented a lot with psychedelics. And I noticed a lot of overlaps with the community that I grew up with. And so hence, I, ended up on this psychedelic Jewish beat as a journalist and also wrote this book. And here we are.
Wow. Yeah, I want to ask some personal questions about this. I also want to state this because I have this last name, Weinstein, which everybody knows or assumes is Jewish. I mean, it is. It's of Jewish lineage. But I was actually raised Christian with a father who really didn't practice anything at all. He used to actually just take off the high holidays and go sailing. Um, so I actually don't know that much. And I've actually just been on this path of like re-embracing my Jewish roots just the last few years. And even then, I'm like still a beginner. So please forgive me if I ask really dumb questions. But I would love to know, was your family, you know, in your upbringing with this kind of culture, were you guys still a very, you know, immersed in the Jewish tradition, or were you, you know, just the people that went on the high holidays only? Like, how did the Judaism fit into your upbringing?
Yeah, I mean, my mom is from New York, and so the breed of New York Jew is a very thick. It's, you know, it's a thick undercurrent wherever you go. And you know, neither one of my parents is particularly observant of Jewish law, but they are very traditional in their ways. And so, you know, like it's, you know, of course we would do the high holidays, you know, the Jewish New Year, Passover, Hanukkah, whatever. We'd also usually like observe Shabbat in some way, which is the Jewish Sabbath. And even just like my parents use a lot of Yiddish. You know, there was just, you know, I was sent to Hebrew school. Like Judaism was a big part of my life. So, you know, even if we weren't necessarily like Orthodox or whatnot, like it was a huge part of my identity, of the way that we related to each other. So yeah.
Love it. And so then let's talk about the psychedelics. I mean, it's so interesting to have these parents that were hanging out with Ram Dass. I mean, that is just so cool. Obviously, everybody's like, wow, what an upbringing that is. But, you know, were your parents just out in the open, like tripping and, you know, you're 7 years old running around? Like, paint us a little picture of what this kind of household was like, and, you know, how you started working with either, you know, cannabis and then other psychedelic medicines. Like, were you know, 8 years old, or, you know, where were the boundaries? Were there any? I'm curious about this.
Yeah. So, my dad would always host kirtan, which is like a Hindu chanting event. And so it would be all these, you know, hippies coming in from Venice Beach or wherever, dressed in Indian garb and, you know, like wearing bindis or saris or just like shmatas on their heads and whatever. And so that was, you know, and everyone would come over and like, you know, smoke weed in the backyard and chant Hindu, like, you know, kirtan in the living room and drink chai. So that was my upbringing. And again, like I was on the side, like we'd also like have big Passover Seders, and my dad would invite his friends from that community and from the Rainbow Gathering. And, you know, so the hippie world was very like strong in my household. I mean, it wasn't though, because my dad's a lawyer. It's not like he's very much aware of the law. And it's like, you know, I wasn't allowed to smoke weed officially until I had, you know, a medical marijuana card when I was 18. I had smoked a little bit in high school, and the guy, I remember the boyfriend who had introduced me to cannabis, or had offered me weed for the first time when I was 16, got in trouble with my stepmother. And people would think like, oh, the Margolin house, you know, they're just whatever, but it was actually not like that. Very traditional parenting as well. And, so yeah, I smoked weed a little bit, like, you know, I got more into it when I was 18. I went to UC Berkeley and really had like a very hippie kind of experience. Like the apple does not fall far from the tree. But I was never a big cannabis person. Like even now, like I barely smoke it at this point. Like I just don't click with it. But yeah, I had, you know, I had all this exposure to psychedelic culture. I read all the books, you know, Be Here Now. Well, obviously that one, but like, you know, like The Doors of Perception or all sorts of other sorts of like psychedelic literature. And so by the time I actually did psychedelics, I was ready for it. I had done a research paper on psychedelics my first semester at Berkeley, and then I tripped that winter break for the first time with my older sister supervising, along with the family medical marijuana doctor. So that's sort of like my introduction, but it wasn't because of my parents necessarily. Did you also ask a question about like Ram Dass being around the house?
Well, I was asking about, actually, I want to ask about this first trip, because again, this is so unique. And by the way, this is what I've tried to have my own family do with my nephews. Like, why don't you have a nice, organized first experience? And of course, they didn't trust me on that. And then my nephew has a bad first experience. But yeah, like, I want to hear about that. What was it? It was like set up with the doctor and your sister, like just trip sitting you?
Sort of. I mean, I had bought all these mushrooms at some like New Year's party when I was home for winter break. I didn't know what to do with them. I just like bought like three eighths. So it was for me and two friends. And I told my sister, and she's like, well, I'll trip sit you. And she just like took us to this guy's house at Venice Beach, and we put the shrooms in like peanut butter and jelly and like washed it down with orange juice, and yeah, that was the trip. We were hanging out in his apartment and then went out to the to the sand, and it was so special. Yeah.
I know. And I just want parents to hear this, because I think there's, I actually think there's going to be a movement around, okay, how do we now have, the reality is teenagers are having experience, even younger, and people are getting curious, especially now that it's all over TikTok, it's all over Instagram, it's in our culture so much now on such a different level that, my 12-year-old nephew is starting to talk to me about DMT. And I'm like, how do you even know what that is? I didn't know what that was at that age. But, this is a really interesting experience to hear about. Yeah, I'm curious. And then having Ram Dass around, I love hearing about this and painting this picture, because then we'll get into your book a little bit. But to what extent was him or any other big spiritual leaders, like, were they intertwined in your life growing up?
Yeah, I mean, I didn't see Ram Dass or anyone else as like specifically special. Like, they were just like my dad's friends. Yeah. And so for that reason, they were also like maybe not just not special, but like maybe on my shit list, like for different reasons. Like, I remember that Ram Dass, when my parents got divorced and my dad got remarried, and I was at that point still very resistant to my stepmother, Ram Dass officiated the wedding. And, I was, for that reason, I kind of hated him. And I didn't see him. I just saw him as another one of the guys, kind of, like my dad and his friends, like smoking weed in the backyard. Like, I didn't know he was famous, and I didn't care about Be Here Now. In fact, I almost resented it. I was like, because my parents would just use Be Here Now as like a catch-all, it's like, you have a problem, just be here now. And it was just kind of like spiritual bypassing a little bit. And so Be Here Now didn't really mean much to me until actually the first time I did mushrooms, where I was like sitting on the beach and I was like so present and content, and I was like, oh, like Be Here Now, I get it. And I hadn't gotten it before. So yeah, but Ram Dass really, like, again, I don't remember that well until I got to be a teenager, all of like my childhood stuff with him. But like, there's one memory in particular where my mom took us to Hawaii, and she and I had been fighting, and I would do this thing where I would like scratch my cheek with my middle finger in order to like flip her off. And when we got to Ram Dass's house, she like told on me to Ram Dass, like just kind of like using him as a therapist. And when we left, he didn't really care, though I was really embarrassed. And when we left, he like said goodbye to me, and he waved and like scratched his cheek with his middle finger. So, everyone has these stories of like going to Hawaii and kissing Ram Dass's feet and whatever. And again, I'm not really of the culture to like treat another person like they're higher level of a human being. But so I'm like, oh, Ram Dass flipped me off.
What a great claim to fame. But yes, I like that. The days of the guru are over. And that's a whole other podcast that we could do. Also, and maybe this is where we can get into your book a little bit. I want to hear about, this Jewish culture and even the Hasid, the Hasidim, especially here in New York, where I'm also located. I remember the first person I met who had told me his whole story of growing up as a Hasid and finding plant medicine and actually like really immersing himself on that path and actually like leaving the community. But then most of his clients were actually Hasids, like working with ayahuasca and working with Kambo. And I'm like, wow, I didn't know this was even available, because it's like, especially in New York, it's like there's these communities where it's like they're just such a big community. I didn't know this was even happening. But maybe this is, intertwined into your book. Should we talk about that a little bit? So you recently published a book. Do you want to tell people a little bit about the premise? Because it's just, again, it's such an interesting niche, and I don't really know. I think like 2 other people out there even talking about this kind of intersection of Judaism and psychedelics. But yeah, let's hear about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's the foundation of the book is, my experience in the psychedelic community of Hindus and the Ram Dass movement, and then finding intersectionality as a journalist who ended up reporting on Hasidic community, and particularly like how psychedelics come into play. So, the person you're describing, I'm like scratching my head. I'm like, do I know this person?
Probably.
Like,
right.
Yeah. Yeah. So yeah, I ended up meeting a lot of people who come from the Hasidic world who, experiment with psychedelics either. And it's not all of them. Like, it's not that you do psychedelics and then you become not religious. Like, for a lot of people, they're already questioning religion, and then they're exploring themselves, and psychedelics come into play. And then other people are like very committed to their lifestyle and, where they're holding religiously, and psychedelics just kind of give them a boost and, help them like re-enliven their practice and spiritual connection.
Wow. That's fascinating. Is there a history of how psychedelics even came into the Hasid community? Because again, they seem so, granted, if you're based in New York City, anything is available anywhere at all times, really. But as a community, they just seem so insular and not like open to what like the, maybe like the mainstream culture or like a certain other culture is doing. But is there a history of like where this came in? Like, was there like one person or one rabbi that had an experience or something?
I don't think it was like one person who had an experience and then it, whatever. But like I would say that, when I came into it, I met first these kids who were on the spectrum of what you would call OTD, or off the derech, off the path, meaning like they're negotiating their relationship to religion. They're not as religious as they grew up, like whatever. And they were doing all these psytrance festivals, psychedelic trance parties in upstate New York and the Catskills, and taking boatloads of psychedelics. And, my question when I met them was like, how, given that psychedelics magnifies so much of what's going on beneath the surface, like if you're coming from such a religious background, like how is Judaism showing up in your psychedelic experiences? So there was that. And then I also got connected to people who are doing it more ceremonially, in ayahuasca circles, using Jewish music as the medicine music, or nigunim, you would say, is like these old Jewish tunes. And nowadays it's everyone's doing it, like Hasidic pop stars and like big people who are very influential in that community are doing psychedelics, are staying religious, but are, kind of enlivening their sort of relationship to religion.
Wow. This is so fascinating. I'm curious, do you write your own opinion about, what this all means or what it's here for? Or, how is this helping them, especially those that are just deepening into their practice, their religion? Do you think this is then rippling into the whole community, even those that are maybe not at all even aware of psychedelics at all? Like, do you think this is going to have a larger effect? And if so, what have you seen change, especially since you've been reporting on this for, years now? Like, have you seen a shift in the overall Jewish communities or even the Hasid communities?
I mean, this is just taking off. Like it's like 1969, but in the Jewish community, and specifically in the Hasidic community. And when I started doing this type of journalism 10 years ago, it was not as prolific as it is now. And again, like different sectors of Hasidic society are doing this. Like, whereas before it was maybe like the OTD people who were, negotiating their relationship with religion. Now it's like mainstream people who just want to like work on their anxiety, like improve their relationships, have very adult reasons for coming to psychedelics that aren't necessarily like rooted in rebellion. So that's something I've observed. And then the Jewish world at large, like a couple of years ago, I co-founded something called the Jewish Psychedelic Summit, and, bringing together all sorts of thought leaders and mystics and rabbis and historians and whatever about the role of psychedelics in Jewish practice and lineage. And so, it's not such a new thing. Like, there is precedent for mind altering experience and the genesis of the Hasidic movement, with the Baal Shem Tov, who's sort of founded Hasidic Judaism. And also like in biblical times, even, there were plant and theogenic plants being used ritualistically and so forth. And so it's not a new idea, but I think we're just uncovering it again.
This is so fascinating because it's really a whole different world to a lot of people. And it's been interesting to watch these kind of like niches coming up in the psychedelic space. I even have a client who's working with primarily Indian women, like to work on some cultural upbringing issues that have been challenging, and working with psychedelics to help them see things differently. I don't like to use the word heal, but essentially, it's like a lot of reprogramming. And like you said, like these very adult reasons to come. And then I had a former client who comes from a background as a Jehovah's Witness. And she actually had a lot of trauma around the upbringing and the being forced to do certain things that just were not aligned with, who she was. And, eventually left, and it was this whole ordeal. But she helps a lot of people work through religious trauma with psychedelics and integration work. So it's been interesting to see this. And I'm curious, you've been kind of on the front lines in the psychedelic scene since day one. Are you seeing more and more of this conversation happening around, like certain religions? Is this happening in other religious groups? I'm also curious, have you gotten some like haters out there that are like, what are you doing? Why are you talking about this? I mean, it seems very edgy. I don't, maybe not, because to me it's ancient. I believe it's actually ingrained into all religions on some level. But yeah, I'm curious, like, what have you noticed on a larger scale out there in the kind of the world of psychedelics and religion intersection?
Yeah, I mean, I think I remember right after we started the Jewish Psychedelic Summit, there was the Mormon Psychedelic Summit. So I think a lot of people who come from Mormonism, who maybe are not practicing it in the same way anymore or whatever, are, also engaging with psychedelics, which is interesting because in the Jewish world, it's both like people coming from secular backgrounds who have maybe had psychedelic experiences and, stumbled into the milk and honey Shabbat tent at Burning Man, or, are looking for ways to like make meaning out of those experiences through Judaism. And again, also as I talked about the Hasidic side, I think with the Mormon Psychedelic Summit, if I'm not mistaken, it's mostly people who are not necessarily practicing Mormonism anymore. It's like kind of like OTD. It's but who relate to it enough, identify with it enough that like they're having this summit. I know also Adriana Kurtzer, a psychedelic attorney, put together this kind of faith and delics group, where she brings in people from different religions into a conversation around psychedelics. And so she's been really good at finding people from all different, faiths to come talk about this.
So fascinating to see how this is going to play out in the future. Yeah, now I'm curious, like, have you gotten any pushback over the years, and especially since your book came out? And, it's interesting, your book came out, I think, what month was it? I know it was before the war that,
November. It came out in November.
Oh, after. Maybe it was the pre-sale then. Yeah. So, how has that been feeling for you? And has there been any critique or, pushback, or is it more the opposite direction? I'm always curious because the psychedelic space seems so, everybody's just so sensitive to begin with, and everybody seems to have an opinion and a voice. And there's a lot of police people out there in the psychedelic space. But I'm curious, like, what has come up around that? And, like for you personally, and then also for your career.
Yeah. Like, weirdly enough, there hasn't been a lot of pushback, I remember writing a story once, a few years ago, for the Times about how psychedelics in, Jewish, psychedelic Jewish phenomenon in the Hasidic world. And the editors were like, we need to find like a voice, like a dissonant voice. And I'm like, I'm telling you, like, it's not there. And it was a thing. Like, they really were like, no, there has to be some rabbi who's come out against this. And it's not. I mean, recently, like very recently in the past few months, there have been a few articles in Yiddish about ayahuasca in particular and how it might be connected to religions that engage with like idolatry. And so there's like a religious question around that, which is not necessarily founded in anything accurate either. So that's a very like esoteric religious question, but it's not like someone saying like psychedelics are bad. And also with regard to my book, people, thank God, have been really, like they've received it very well. And I mean, my issue personally is like came out a month after, exactly a month after the war started. I was actually living in Israel and came back after the war. I also had to come home and like promote my book and whatever. But I was feeling a little bit like it feels tone deaf to, promote this book when, there's so many other things to say right now. And, I'm not like, I don't fancy myself like a commentator on Israel-Palestine, and, whatever opinions I have, I try to not talk about them publicly because it's so heated. But yeah, so the pushback came from my own personal resistance of like not being so much in a place of wanting to promote, but at the point when I really had to. So yeah.
That's fascinating. Because yeah, I mean, I even thought about that, what it must be like publishing this book. And yeah, I had heard that you were in Israel. And it is very heated. I mean, it's so nuanced that I feel the same way. It's like, I've had people assume how I feel about certain things, or, ask me questions. And I'm like, look, that's, first of all, it's so deep, and it's, it's not just something like now. It's been going on for such a long time. And I don't think we know what's right or wrong. I just know that, like everybody else, like no one wants to see this happening. But it's interesting. Has this come up as you've been promoting the book? Like, are people trying to get you to say certain things, or you just kind of like, look, like these are my boundaries? I'm curious how you deal with this, because it's it's been hard for a lot of people. One of my good friends ran a Jewish renewal group here in upstate New York, and she's like, I don't even know how to answer questions. Like that's not what I'm here doing, and I don't know. It's like I'm sorting through my own feelings, and I'm also a leader. So when you're a leader in this space, like what is that like? Have you been having a lot of people come to you for, hey, Madison, comment on this, for our article, or, has that been happening to you?
To an extent, yeah. I think in some situations, like especially, in November, like I was doing a lot of interviews for my book, or, promotion stuff. And it's just like, it was awkward not to acknowledge the war, especially it's a book on Judaism, which we don't have to get into like the ridiculousness of like associating Judaism at large with, you know, the Israel-Palestine conflict, and they're yeah, you know, like just because I wrote something Jewish doesn't mean, again, I should have to talk about Israel-Palestine. But I do, as someone who lives there part-time, this is very close to my heart. And like you said about this renewal leader, like you're still parsing out your own feelings. And like I was personally still just like unwinding from the, you know, trauma of being there when the war broke out. So, you know, to speak intelligently, it's like you just can't. Like, it's like, what do I have to say? It's just completely heartbroken. Like I didn't have, you know, I just didn't have the articulation. But, you know, I have tried to sort of like come to like, you know, the psychedelic way of looking at things. And I was reporting a story on psychedelics and specifically ayahuasca being used in coexistence ceremonies between Israelis and Palestinians. And I was also reporting on psychedelic use among settlers in the West Bank. And so, and seeing how that sort of like promotes the messianic consciousness that, you know, is not absent from the situation of what's going on in the West Bank. So it is something I think deeply about. And my baseline response is just like if you're going to apply psychedelic thinking to the situation, it's one that, it makes basically is a perspective that takes trauma into account and looks at like, how do you make this situation as inflict the least possible trauma. And also what it is to think psychedelically is to be able to like move past binaries and be able to hold multiple truths at the same time and have them all exist and not be like, well, if my truth exists, yours can't or whatever. But like, you know, there's that. I mean, I think that's the story of that land is there is so much what you would think like contradictory or conflicting perspectives, and that's what makes it so dynamic and explosive and also beautiful.
Wow. Yeah. And isn't that interesting? It's like thinking psychedelically. I've actually not heard that before, but that's exactly the way to describe. Like I personally believe this is one of the most beautiful aspects of these medicines. Has us open up and see that the world is not binary, right? It's not just like this or that. And the irony is, and this is happening everywhere. It's not just the psychedelic space, but I, made this comment that there's a lot of policing. There's a lot of, this is right, you're wrong. I asked Rick Doblin about this after the closing ceremony and at Psychedelic Science, because that was like this whole, hoopla. And he had this interesting viewpoint. And I was like, okay, look at the larger picture here. Thinking very psychedelically about this. But I wanted to ask you about that because you've been in this space a while. And I'm always curious because I even go through this, and I know a lot of other people I know in this space go through this, like having our own value system, but also seeing the Wild West of what's happening out there in the psychedelic space. It's, there's parts of me that's like, oh my God, this is scary. And there's parts of me that think it's the most beautiful thing ever and gives me a lot of hope for the future of the world. But, I guess this is like anything in the world. There's always this division. There's always going to be the extremes. It's life. There's polarities. But I'm curious, someone who's been so immersed in this space, do you ever get kind of like disgruntled or like roll your eyes and have that kind of like, oh my God, this space is going completely downhill and it's just a utter shit show with people arguing and voices and, like now the Wild West of anybody and their mother becoming a psychedelic therapist with, 2-day training. What are your views on like where this space is going? Like, and do you get those feelings? Because I get them where I'm like, oh my God, I love these medicines, but maybe I should just quit this space because it drives me crazy sometimes.
Yeah, it's just like so saturated and so like, Yeah, like I don't know. It's like so many people I've dealt with in the psychedelic space are not people I would ever want to trip with, and they're not safe space. And it's like, wait, we're here talking about psychedelic wellness and just like how to conduct yourself and move through the world in a way that reflects that you have been influenced by and inspired by these medicines, and you're a better person for it. I don't think that psychedelics automatically make you a better person. They just make you more you. And if if you do have a challenging trip, if you're not, and you have to face yourself and you don't integrate that, like, again, it's just inflates the ego after the ego comes back online. And there are so many toxic elements of this quote unquote industry. And, growing up for me, it was like a movement, there was this activist spirit to it. You also felt like there was an element of rebellion. You're doing what the government says you can't do and you're doing it anyways. And you were on there was like a moral, like foundation to the culture. Whereas today it's just very much like industry, money, like capitalism, whatever. And yeah, I mean, how many people do I know who work in psychedelics and have tripped twice and, just haven't really fully absorbed the essence of what psychedelic really is. So I don't know. I mean, it's so saturated, and I want to say like it's beautiful and it's amazing that so many people are interested and this, there's so many businesses coming online and people have access to psychedelic therapy, like above ground and underground and whatever. And I'm like, what do I want out of life? What if psychedelics shown me that I want is just to live healthily and do meaningful work and do my yoga and eat well and have really beautiful Shabbats and, do mushrooms here and there, ayahuasca, whatever, and just call it a day and not, I don't know, sometimes I'm I don't want to play. I don't need to prove myself in this space. And these are also not people all the time who I want to deal with. It doesn't bring me joy to wade through an ocean of, of people who are still very much in their processes.
Very well said. It's been very interesting to navigate and also try to keep myself in check of okay, I have compassion and understanding and also knowing everybody's on their own path and there's definitely going to be things I don't agree with. And, I choose to just have my own personal boundaries that are very strong. But also to know on some level, who's to say what's right or wrong or good or bad or how this is all going to play out. I've seen a lot and I'm sure you've seen more than me at this point. And, I always remind my clients too, is really stay strong on your own pillar of light, your own boundaries, your own value system, and just know what you want. And kind of like you said, here's my path. This is the work I'm doing. This is the meaning I want to bring to the world. There's definitely going to be some bad players like there are probably in every industry there is, and now we're bringing in this influx of capital and venture capital and random, people coming from all directions trying to create new drugs and this and that. And I'm I don't know, who's to say what's right or wrong? I just know what's right for me. And, we'll see what happens. But it's definitely been a strange, very psychedelic experience, right? To see how psychedelics have grown and how fast it's grown. But I want to hear a little bit about, what has been transpiring for you since writing the book. And that was probably a process, I would assume. I don't know, knowing you, maybe you wrote it very fast, but most other people I talk to, it's yeah, I've written the book. It took me 5 years. What has come up with you and shifting in your work since, moving on and taking on new projects and also being back and forth to Israel and now New York? I'm curious, what's next and what's been happening?
Yeah. It is a weird moment because this book was so much a life goal. And it's, when I wrote the book, I mean, yeah, like it's the accumulation of like 10 years of reporting in the psychedelic Jewish space and a lifetime of being in it. And, officially I wrote the book, I spent like a year writing it and I didn't like what I wrote. And so I went last year to Tzfat, which is this Kabbalistic mystical city in northern Israel, and just like scratched the whole thing and started over and rewrote it in like 6 weeks. So, so that was that process. So yeah, you were kind of right when you said I wrote it in a month, but like kind of yes, kind of no. And now I'm actually working on a second book, which is a practical guide. It's like a Jewish psychedelic manual. So sort of like, how do you actually do this? How do you incorporate ritual and spirituality into your psychedelic experience through a Jewish lens? I'm also writing this kind of psychedelics 101 coffee table book with a publisher called Artisan, and it's called The Double Blind Guide to Psychedelics. I co-founded magazine Double Blind, and so the brand got this book deal that I'm working on now. And yeah, I mean, I'm sort of like, a lot of what I want to be doing at this juncture is, I want to continue writing and reporting and being a journalist. And I want to, really put it into practice, apply it. Like, and so I've been thinking of ways that I can like be more like in an educational capacity or hands-on with people. And so yeah, that's kind of, where it's at, but it is a weird sort of like postpartum moment of being like, now what? I'm like, and it's also the book was so personal. It was it was kind of like the story of this like Jewish psychedelic generation and the community that I'm at home in, but also the story of my life. In a lot of ways, it's a memoir. And, the story of my life is still very much in progress. And so what do where's that going? So, yeah.
That's amazing. I know, to be writing a memoir and so fast, so young, and getting it out there. And yeah, now, there's a whole world ahead of you. I'm curious, as a journalist, and especially with the experience of being at Double Blind for so long and being like one of the first big, startup psychedelic publications like that. How do you think that's shifting? I mean, I've been kind of questioning like where this is all going with AI coming online and so much content going on, and like having to make a living, like monetization. I think we've seen there's some other, like, I really like Lucid News as well. And Lucid, I've heard, is, struggled to make a profit, and I don't know if they actually do. What have you seen out there, and like, what are the realities of having your own, psychedelic or any kind of online publication, especially in this day and age of just content being consumed so much on, the TikToks and Instagrams and wherever else people are just constantly consuming, podcasts, videos, YouTube. Where do you think this is all going with journalism? And do you think, I mean, of course, there's people that say like, oh, it's just AI is going to take over and we're just never going to need humans again, which I totally disagree with. But have you thought about this, and what's your experience been with this kind of new world that might transpire over the next, few years and beyond?
Yeah, I mean, the journalism industry is completely falling apart. It's unfunded, like unless you, have like major investors or family money or whatever it is, like it's just not viable. And especially now there's like an economic lull, it seems, in the psychedelic space in general. So, I think a lot of these companies are struggling. And even at large, I mean, there were all these like layoffs in journalism last week. And, there needs to be stuff like Double Blind or Lucid News, that kind of like speak to the more psychedelic, nuanced psychedelic conversations. 'Cause also the mainstream news is not really speaking to like the problems in psychedelia. They're just like in it for the sexy headlines, like 5-MeO retreats in Mexico are happening. Like, okay. And, and then who's going to cover the questions about like the safety and the legitimacy and, the ethical, all the sorts of like deep state questions, that the mainstream audience is just, it's too esoteric for them. So yeah, I wish I could say I had like a more optimistic, perspective on it, but I don't. And so, yeah, I don't know. I think it's the Wild West, and I think people are going to have to be really discerning about what's truth and where to find that truth. Like who are the platforms? Which are the platforms that you can trust?
Yeah. Yeah. And it's interesting, it's been interesting to just read and see new articles coming out, and then some whistleblowers. And that's always interesting as well, that, yeah, there's people reporting on, issues and safety. I'm curious, at Double Blind, you guys started getting into the online courses and the kind of like live course model, which I think a lot of people go that direction because it seems to be like the way. But I'm curious, as a business model, is it still, is it still effective? Like, are people still taking online courses? Are people still buying how to make your own mushrooms when maybe there's like YouTube videos out there now? And, this is kind of where I always wonder. I'm like, God, these days there's just, it's like you can follow TikTokers who are probably filming it. I mean, I don't do that, but I know that that's happening. So how does that work with the monetization? Like, has it been effective, or is it just kind of slowly growing? I'm curious about that.
I mean, that seems to be like everyone's business model nowadays is like an online course. I can't really I don't know the details of how well that's working out for anyone in particular, but I do know that seems to be what a lot of media companies are writing off of.
Yeah, it's interesting. And then, what are your views on, the venture capital coming in and, and like you just said it, like there's a lull, which I've not known about, but I've noticed. I mean, it seems to be that, there was a lot of companies that went gung-ho and came in and even went public and then went under and fell apart and sold off. And that seemed very quick. That was only in like a 2-year period or 3 years, maybe. What have you seen with that kind of, like the money and the capital that's just been pouring in so aggressively the last few years? Like, has there been like, what's happening on the front line there?
Yeah. I mean, I think there was a little bit of this like cannabis effect and psychedelics where, in cannabis also, like there's a lot of excitement. I remember, California 2016 when weed got legal, beyond just medical marijuana. And there were all of these like cute brands. And it was just parties. And it was just like the golden age of cannabis, of legal cannabis culture, right? I mean, again, I remember my father being kind of like, feeling left out at that point. He's like, these are not the people who like brought the movement forward. These are just the people who are like, economizing off of it, now that it's like not too weird, or they're not gonna like risk their freedom or reputations. But, and psychedelics similarly, have had this trajectory where I think a lot of mushroom brands that are both like, above board functional mushrooms waiting to like just incorporate psilocybin into their menus, or underground like couture, psilocybin gummy companies waiting to just come on board and become legal. And it's actually not happening so fast. And I think people are starting to recognize that. There is decriminalization in a lot of localities, but, on a federal level, like it's only going to happen through the FDA, and that's only in very particular protocols with very particular pharmaceutical companies that are pushing that through. And I think people are realizing like this, and it's psychedelics are not weed. Like, it's ridiculous to like, it's not the same model, and like, it's not something you need to like sell to someone to use every day. I mean, granted, like microdosing is, I think people tried that before, tried that as like a marketing push. That's something you can do every day and overcharge for a quarter gram of mushrooms. But like, but but yeah, it's not like this. These are experiences that people generally come to once every couple of months. And so like, how do you continue to market that? So I don't know like where it's going. And I think as the laws change, which might take longer than people realized, you know, the industry will evolve. But right now I do see like a little bit of like things are like weirdly like a lull, or it's like, I don't want to say it's like stable, but it's not that like, you know, ever inflating balloon.
I've said this for years too, because I'm like, wow, how many mushroom chocolate companies do we really need? I personally do them, you know, even in my microdose tincture that I buy from a friend who makes it lasts me like 9 months. You know, it's like one bottle that's this big. You know, maybe I'm not doing enough, or I mean, I'm doing what I need to do, but it's funny because I've said the same thing, because I've, of course, been offered everything under the sun, and I've been given everything under the sun. And I usually end up just giving it away to other people. Because again, and yeah, I have, you know, I'd had a mushroom chocolate bar given to me, and then it's like, I have it like 2 years later, you know, like I don't do mushrooms even monthly. So, I don't really see how it's a market. And it's been interesting because even going to a place like Psychedelic Science to see, yeah, there's a ton of functional mushrooms, and now these microdose companies. And now I keep hearing about there's people out there just blatantly even advertising it. Even someone who's very big in the psychedelic space, a big psychedelic company, had this microdosing challenge where they were like, you know, it said right there on their website, like you know, they basically connect them to the people selling the microdoses. And I'm like, wow, they're just like blatantly going for it and doing something illegal. I've heard about the farmer's market in Brooklyn selling mushroom tea. I've heard about the storefront and somewhere in New York City that was just blatantly selling mushrooms. And it's been interesting to see. And, you know, we'll see how it plays out. But I actually really agree with you there. I'm like, everyone's very gung-ho, and then they're going to realize, you know, it's not like scalable the way people say or the way people think. And you're right, it's not cannabis. And even cannabis, I think, I'm like, I actually don't work with cannabis much or ever actually. But yeah.
Like cannabis is like a regular use product, you know, whereas, I mean, not for everybody or not all the time, but like, you know, at least people like regularly use like CBD salve or tinctures or, you know, smoking joints every day. Like that's a market. No one's doing mushrooms every day unless they're microdosing.
So interesting to see what will happen. So let's hear about, you know, where can people get your book? Where do you want them to actually purchase it? By the way, not just where, because everyone knows about Amazon, but where else can we really get it? And then also, you know, what you have coming up that you like people to know about, or anything you want to shout out of your own work that, you know, people can follow you for.
Yeah. So, you can buy my book on Amazon. You can also go to my personal website at madisonmargolin.com, and there's a list of retailers for the book. And also follow along through my website or my Instagram at Madison Margolin. And what do I have coming up? Yeah, I mentioned the 2 books that I'm working on. You know, I also am a contributing editor at Ayin Press, which is a Jewish publishing studio. And so there's a lot of fun Jewish psychedelic content that we have brewing. And, you know, what was the question? Just anything else?
Anything you want to shout out other than the book, but yeah.
Yeah, just, you know, just kind of stay on the lookout. Ayin Press, the 2 books that I'm writing, and get the book, leave a review on Amazon if you're into Amazon. If not, no worries. And yeah, it's really fun to be able to talk to you and reconnect on the podcast after all these years.
Oh, Madison, thank you so much for doing this work that you're doing and really being this leading voice. I do have to say it's opened me up, you know, for people like me. They're kind of like, okay, I just kind of swore off this whole part of my culture. And I've been kind of re-embracing it. I've interviewed you and Rabbi Zach, and I've had some other talks. I'm in the Jewish Entheogenic group, wherever it is, on Facebook. And, you know, it's really interesting to be kind of creating this unity and having more and more people really open up and see that, there is hope. Maybe we can get, Israel and Palestine to all drink ayahuasca together and see what happens. So, and also, just your fun stories. So thank you so much. And I'm so glad you came on, and we'll share your links with everybody and be on the lookout for these new books coming out.
Thank you.
I hope you enjoyed the episode. If you're feeling inspired, I'd appreciate it if you showed your love with a review. And check out my YouTube channel where you can find the video version of this podcast. You can also head to BethAWeinstein.com to learn more about me and grab my free business growth trainings. Remember, you carry your own unique medicine, and your medicine is what we need for these times.